South Dakota, June 1823. On the vast expanse of the undulating prairie that extends to the horizon in every direction, a contingent of mules, horses, and men moves warily alongside a river, with pensive eyes switching from the water to the surrounding landscape, searching for signs of danger. They are hundreds of miles from anything resembling a city, in territory that does not belong to them. They are a mix of men from a plethora of backgrounds and ethnicities, dressed in a menagerie of wool shirts, buckskin leggings, boots, moccasins, serapes, raccoon skin caps, and belts. Their common goal, put simply, is money, made by way of accumulating and selling beaver pelts, the coveted material that makes the popular top hats of the day worn throughout New York, Paris, and London. Their methods are simple. Set traps for the beavers, after which the animals will become ensnared in the traps and drown. Then, the trappers will return to collect the beaver pelts and repeat this process until the beaver population has been exhausted, before finally moving on. But, in this case, simple does not equal easy. Opposing them are the elements, from blazing heat to icy cold, from snow to dust storms, from droughts to flash flooding. Animal attacks, from the numerous grizzly bears which prowl the continent, to rattlesnakes, to buffalo stampedes, pose an ever-present threat. Hostile native tribes like the Blackfoot, Arikara, and Comanche have, already, in these early years of the fur trade, killed many trappers in gruesome ways for violating their tribal territorial bounds. Among this party of men are some who will go on to become legends in the annals of mountain man history. They are commanded by William H. Ashley and Major Andrew Henry, and among their ranks are Hugh Glass and Jedediah Smith, all men whose future exploits will become the stuff of mountain man legend. Smith is an anomaly amongst this already anomalous lot, as he is a devout Methodist, reads the Bible daily, and refrains from coarse language, as well as dalliances with unknown women and strong drink. On this day, he is approached by Major Henry and directed to ride south to Ashley's fort, aptly known as Fort Ashley. He is to inform Ashley that the company is in need of more horses and that the Arikara tribe will likely be the closest people with which to trade in horseflesh. Jedediah Smith is still a relative neophyte to the world of trapping, but he is a man on the rise within the ranks of his company, as his reputation as a stalwart and trustworthy companion grows by the day. And so, Smith sets out to the south, and is fortuitously met by Ashley on the trail. The pair then proceed to the Arikara village, where they seek to buy more horses. The Arikara, a northern plains semi-agricultural tribe known both for their prowess in trade and warfare, whose ire had been stirred by some recent bad dealings with other white traders, are in a less than cordial mood. However, Ashley and his men have guns and ammunition that the Arikara know they can acquire through few, if any, other sources. Thus, there is a terse and tense peace, as often happens in these instances on the frontier. In the wilds of North America, native tribes and fur trappers are not necessarily antagonistic. In fact, sometimes the case can be quite the opposite. For centuries in colonial America and Canada, native tribes had been employed by large fur company magnates to supply them with the highly profitable furs of the deer, mink, otter, and beaver that had profligated their homeland. However, as game populations began to dwindle, the fur companies eventually brought their search for pelts to the expanses of the North American prairies and Rocky Mountains. The tribes who inhabited these lands oftentimes expressed little to no interest in working for fiat currency or goods when their lifestyles and economies were focused on hunting the immense herds of American bison that populated the plains. Thus, in the spirit of their predecessors in men like Daniel Boone and Simon Kenton, who were known as long hunters, the fur companies have scoured the outlying cities of the frontier, offering gainful employment to any man with the gumption and skills to venture onto the inhospitable frontier to procure the valuable fur of the innumerable beaver that inhabited the rivers and streams that crisscrossed the continent. Still, fur companies routinely employ native persons as translators, trackers, and trappers. Many of the early mountain men owe their skills to lessons learned from their native guides. Even in the 19th century, in the middle of the plains, no culture existed entirely in a vacuum. This could be seen not only in the dress of both native trappers and tribes, who often traded in various garbs such as jewelry made from beads from China, hats made in factories on the eastern seaboard, and buffalo robes harvested and carefully prepared in centuries-old fashion by native tribeswomen. While tools such as firearms indeed proved invaluable to the native tribes, so too did steel tools and implements such as axes, knives, and cooking utensils. Thus, a robust trade between the fur-trapping companies and the inhabiting tribes of the northern plains has been a mainstay for years, even in the 1820s. At the Arikara village, initial dealings are made between Smith, Ashley, and the Arikara. As the sun begins to set, it is mutually agreed that trading will continue the following day. Ashley splits his forces into two, leaving one on land to guard the supplies they had brought out from the boats, and the other to man the two boats which were anchored about 30 yards from the banks of the river. It is decided that Ashley will be in direct command of the boats, and Smith will be in charge of the force guarding the supplies. Now, nearly all of the mountain men present go about their nightly duty of making dinner, cleaning their weapons, checking their supplies, and preparing for the next day's travel and trading. But when all have finally bedded down for the night, two men from the mountain man's party sneak into the Arikara camp with whiskey and trinkets that they hope to trade for illicit relations with the Arikara women. This proves to be a fatal mistake. Just after midnight, Colonel Ashley is awakened by 3 Arikara warriors who have snuck onto the boat and are attempting to loot its cargo. He brandishes his pistol and chases them off the boat. But just as the Arikara make it to the shore, and the sound of sloshing water from their swim strokes goes quiet, it is suddenly replaced by the frantic screams of one of the 2 mountain men who have snuck into the Arikara camp. He and his companion had indeed found the Arikara women they were hoping to, but they had also found the Arikara men, who were not happy with the presence of intruders attempting to defile their wives, daughters, and sisters. His companion has been cut down where he was found. The surviving trapper, a man named Edward Rose, has escaped and now appears on the banks of the river, making his way, as fast as he can, for the trapper's camp on shore. As he runs, he screams that his partner in mischief, a man named Aaron Stevens, is dead, and the Arikara are now in a collectively angry mood. Still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness and alerted to both the attempted robbery of Ashley's boat and the killing of their comrade in the camp by the now enraged Arikara, the mountain men begin to hurriedly and vociferously debate their options. Some argue for immediately moving the horses they have, a sizable herd by this point, to the opposite shore before daybreak, so that they might be in a better position to flee when the sun does come up, with at least the river between them and the expected Arikara attack. Others argue for the retrieval of Stephen's body. As these debates carry on, a lone Arikara suddenly appears on the horizon above the riverbanks. Still in the dark, he calls out that he will try to broker a deal for the return of their comrade's body, for the price of one of their best horses. The mountain men agree to this, but a short time later, the enterprising Arikara returns to inform them that unfortunately he will not be able to uphold his end of the deal. Stevens's body has in fact been so badly mutilated that there is nothing left to return to them. This, understandably, sends a cold chill through the ranks of the shore party. It is decided that they will now have to move the horses as quickly as possible as the sunrise nears with every passing minute. Remaining calm and cool by all accounts, Jed Smith embraces his first real opportunity at leadership and calmly directs the movement of the horses across the river. However, as the sun begins to rise and a large number of horses and men are still mid-river or on the near bank waiting their turn, the mountain men are greeted with a horrifying sight. Silhouetted in the new morning sunlight are hundreds of Arikara warriors, tamping shot down into their muskets, knocking their arrows, and taking up offensive positions. The full gravity of the situation is now painfully apparent to everyone present. They are stuck, with the enemy having the high ground and no cover to be found. Within moments, musket balls, spears, and arrows begin to rain down on them from above. Dozens of horses and a number of trappers fall dead in the initial volley, with many others gravely wounded. The screams of the injured and dying men and horses fills the air, as Ashley and the men on the boats attempt to meet them on the other shore and make their getaway. The men on the boats provide what covering fire they can, and the men on shore take cover behind the bodies of the dead horses. From here, as chaos reigns all around, Jed Smith coolly and calmly doles out directions to those in his charge. As he and his men fire and reload, they simultaneously make strategic retreats, moving by leapfrogging from one defensive position to the next, until reaching the comparative safety of the boats. Amidst all of this, Ashley's boat has run aground momentarily on a sandbar. The other boat, at around this same time, cuts ties to their anchor and begins moving downstream in an attempt to at least save themselves from this seemingly hopeless situation. Ashley's boat is quickly freed and makes its way as close to the shore as possible. Smith and his men finally reach the banks of the river, dive in, and begin to frantically swim. Some are hit by arrows and musket balls and sink under the surface, never to be seen again. Some are swept downriver beyond the extended oars and hands of their comrades, also never to be seen again. The lucky few who managed to make it onto the boats, including Jed Smith and Hugh Glass, now hunker down and return fire as the boats make their way as quickly as possible down the Missouri River and out of range of Arikara musket and arrow fire. For some of these men, this will be the end of their mountain man adventures. Those who decide they have had enough of this wild and dangerous life are put on boats back to St. Louis, along with their injured and recovering comrades. No one blames them for preferring the comforts of home to this lonely land where life is all too often short and seemingly cheap. But the careers of William Ashley, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith are far from over. One incident immediately following the battle speaks to the human cost of this attack that will be felt by families scattered all over the American states back east. Hugh Glass himself will go on to pen a heart-wrenching letter to the family of John Gardner, a mountain man who had been killed in the Arikara fight. The letter reads, "Dear Sir, my painful duty is to tell you of the death of your son, who befell at the hands of the Indians 2nd June in the early morning. He lived little while after he was shot and asked me to inform you of his sad fate. We brought him to the ship, where he soon died. Mr. Jedediah Smith, young man of our company, made a powerful prayer which moved all of us greatly, and I am persuaded that John died in peace. His body we buried with others near this camp and marked the graves with a log. His things we send to you. The savages are greatly treacherous. We traded with them as friends, but after great storm of rain and thunder, they came at us before light, and many were hurt. I myself was shot in the leg. Master Ashley is bound to stay in these parts till the traitors are rightly punished. Your obedient servant, Hugh Glass." This letter denotes not only Glass's deep sense of humanity, as well as his anger towards the Arikara, but it is the first mention of the piety and character of Jedediah Smith. Smith would mount an expedition along with an unnamed French-Canadian trader to a nearby fort in the hopes of mounting an even larger retributive force to supplement those that Ashley had already mustered. After this, he would carry on to travel perhaps more country than any other mountain man in history. But the many stories of the legendary exploits of Hugh Glass, William Ashley, and Jedediah Smith are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
July 14th, 1828, Southwestern Oregon.
As the initial rays of sunlight struggled their way through the dense forest canopy and vaporous morning fog, finally reflecting on the rippling waters of the Umpqua River, a group of 4 men prepared to cast off in their dugout canoe. Their intention is to find a more passable route of travel rather than the circuitous, marshy path they had found themselves on in the last few days. 3 of the men are part of a 15 to 20 person band of fur trappers making their way north to Fort Vancouver in hopes of trading some of the fruits of their labors for some much-needed supplies, horses, and a respite from the omnipresent threats presented by the wilds of the Pacific Northwest. For them, the conditions presented by their current environs are at once shakingly unfamiliar and tranquilizingly routine. They had been making their way across the American West for the better part of 2 years, from St. Louis, across the Salt Lake Desert, the Mojave Desert, over the Sierra Nevadas, and up from Southern California to Northern California, and then on to Oregon. They had seen all manner of hardships along the way, from grisly attacks to hostile Mexican government officials to attacks from hostile native tribes. Less than a year earlier, some of these men had been among the few survivors to emerge from an attack by the Mojave tribe in the austere, Joshua tree-strewn desert that bears their name. They hailed from all manners of backgrounds and ethnicities, though most were American Protestants from states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, and New York. Though their diversity in culture and experience makes their collective categorization all but impossible, it is safe to say that none among them had seen wilderness like what they had encountered in the previous few weeks. They had made their way up from the San Joaquin Valley in central California, northwest through giant redwoods to the northern California coast. They had hung close to the coastline, staying as close to the water as possible during the low tide and moving back up toward the timber as the water level necessitated. As they made their way north, they found the terrain and the native tribes less and less hospitable. The 4th man in their crew, though, felt right at home as they paddled up the frigid river lined with Oregon white oaks. He was a member of the Umpqua tribe, an umbrella group of several smaller subgroups, all of which had resided here in the Umpqua Valley for generations. Specifically, he was a member of the Lower Umpqua Band. The etymology of the word Umpqua is thought to trace back to a word from their neighbors to the south, the Tolowa tribe. It is theorized to mean a place along the river, or thundering water, or dancing water, or bring across the river. They spoke the Siuslaw language, lived in cedar plank houses, and survived by both hunting and fishing in forests, streams, and ocean inlets in their home territory. They were also, like most tribes in North America at this point, increasingly impacted and influenced by the encroachment of Europeans and North Americans in their homelands. Like most tribes along the Northern California and Southern Oregon coastal ranges, the Umpqua were not averse to violent retaliation in response to trespassing in their territory. But they were not averse to making their lives easier either. However masterful the Umpqua, and for that matter any native tribe, may have been as woodsmen, life for them was still incredibly difficult. Not only was hunting made easier with firearms, but cleaning and dressing the animal were often easier with steel knives than with stone tools. Falling trees and splitting firewood was a far less laborious task when using a steel axe obtained from the whites. Though beads made from seashells and bones were indeed beautiful, the glass beads from the European and American traders could be garnered in a wider array of colors and a far greater quantity. Medicines, foodstuffs, blankets, fabrics, and gunsmithing services were all highly valued goods and services that most tribes could procure through few, if any, other sources than via trading with the whites. This led to an unavoidable mixing of cultures and a variety of cultural, economic, and military alliances. Though clashes were frequent throughout the West, as had been the case for the trapping party in the preceding weeks, the prevailing rule was that the enemy of one's enemy was one's friend. Many in the modern world often create a fundamental false binary of simply whites versus natives, when this does a fundamental disservice to both groups. The native tribes from Alaska to Argentina lived in harsh, conflict-ridden worlds
in which life was a constant struggle for resources and safety. Just as in the modern world, pragmatism often won out over cultural purity in the interest of survival. Though this party of mountain men were clearly and presently trespassers in Umpqua territory, they could perhaps serve more utility as allies than enemies, or so the Umpqua had initially thought. And, for their part, nothing would have made the mountain men happier. Though many among them were certainly partial to the ardent nationalism of the early 19th century, almost all were cultural and economic pragmatists, first and foremost. Their goal was not to acquire territory, nor to entice the native tribes into a fight. Quite the contrary, their endeavors were essentially purely economic in nature, and thus many mountain men prided themselves on their ability to navigate the turbulent waters between such wildly different cultures. This was especially true for the leader of this party, the young but already legendary Jedediah Smith. Though he was only 29 years old, he had already spent a decade of his life in the wilds of the American West. He had been born in 1799 in what is today Bainbridge, New York, to Jedediah Smith Sr. and Sally Strong, longtime New Englanders of staunch, puritanical stock. The family moved to Erie County, Pennsylvania when Smith was still a boy, and by age 13, his innate thirst for adventure led him to find a job as a clerk on a Lake Erie freighter. Here, he came across a number of frontiersmen and fur trappers, many under the employ of the Hudson Bay Company. Thoroughly regaled with tales of daring, adventure, and riches had from capitalizing on Europe's obsessive demand for New World furs, Smith set out for St. Louis at the age of 17, and by 1822, census information shows him living in the burgeoning, though doubtless still austere, frontier city. Here, his hopes of obtaining employment with a fur company expedition were realized when he, along with 99 other adventure-hungry young men, answered a newspaper ad in the Missouri Gazette. The ad was posted by General William H. Ashley, another eventually legendary figure in the history of the mountain men and fur trade in the American West. General Ashley called for 100 enterprising young men to head northwest to the Rockies in search of beaver pelts that were used to make the hats now so in vogue in London taverns and Paris cafes. In the spring of 1823, the company, known to history as Ashley's 100, left St. Louis, and Jedediah left his old life behind forever. He had risen quickly through the loose commandatory hierarchy of the fur trapping companies, comporting himself with courage and composition time and again under the duress of frustration, starvation, thirst, and combat. He had seen countless close friends die in violent ways, endured seemingly endless travel and privation, and seen his boyish good looks scarred forever after narrowly surviving an attack from a grizzly bear. Through it all, Smith had been noted for his moderation, his piety, his reliability, and his skill as a woodsman, marksman, and trapper. Now, though, as he found himself seated in a canoe next to his Umpqua guide and trapper compatriots, Jed Smith was tired. He had come thousands of miles, seen so much, and yet still had not managed to acquire the financial success he had hoped to nearly a decade ago. As the iridescently haunting rays of sunlight began to poke more and more holes in the forest canopy, one can imagine the deep sense of fatigue that must have set in as Smith surmised his current situation in its totality. He and his men were all travel-weary, within striking distance of starvation, and summarily weakened in both body and mind. The preceding days had been worryingly turbulent, and they must have weighed heavily on his mind. He and his men had encountered the Umpqua a few days earlier in a trade meeting that encapsulated the terse, uncertain, and all too human nature of Native and Euro-American interactions spanning from the 1400s to the 21st century. Having spotted some Umpqua sentries at a distance, Smith and his party made signs to parley and initiate trade in hopes of both restoring their supplies and building an amicable relationship. Unlike their Spanish predecessors and American successors, this party of trappers hoped not to conquer or colonize, but merely to peacefully pass through on their way to Fort Vancouver. Even the most ardent extoller of the virtues of manifest destiny among them would concede that now, with a party of not quite 24 objectively overworked and severely undernourished trappers, was not the time nor the place to attempt a conquest of any kind. The Umpqua, who at this point in history rarely saw any white men, were simultaneously wary, curious, and confused. And given even a cursory glance at the territorial geopolitics all along the western coast at the time, but specifically in California and Oregon, it is quite understandable why. Though California had long been ostensibly under the control of the Spanish, the English and the Russians had, at this point, spent decades making forays into the ocean inlets and mountainscapes of the Pacific Northwest in hopes of laying claim to its innumerable resources in both flora and fauna. Private interests such as the Hudson Bay Company had also spent small fortunes on incursions deep into the unknowns of the region in hopes of establishing networks of native tribes and collecting intelligence on any potential natural boundaries to be had. In the Treaty of 1818, the United States and Britain, awash in the geocentric hubris of the time, agreed to share exploratory custody of a territory that was not theirs to begin with. Regardless, in the intervening decades, the Umpqua and their neighbors had seen a marked increase in the frequency and size of the expeditionary parties making their incursions into the territory. They had been intermittently accepting of and hostile to such incursions, but in recent months had warmed to the idea of building amicable relations with white traders in hopes of fortifying their own wealth. Jedediah Smith and his party had hoped to capitalize on this, though their interactions with the Umpqua's neighbors to the south had been terse at best and violent at worst up until now. However, seeing the only prudent course of action as taking the most amicable route, Smith intended to make some good trades and build at least some usable amount of rapport with their reluctant, suspicious hosts. The two parties had convened at the mountain men's camp on the west side of the bend in the river. At first, the mood was suspicious. However, after some initial offers and counteroffers, both sides began to relax, and a sense of reserved joviality seemed to prevail. Then, one of the men informed Jedediah Smith that an axe and a skinning knife had gone missing from the party's supplies. It was apparent that, if one of the trappers had not taken the missing items, one of the Umpqua had. Though known for his magnanimity and charity in such situations, Smith had learned through the incessant native thievery that had plagued his party since the Dakotas that no amount of charity would render the goods returned. And so he saw fit to employ more forceful measures. The suspected Umpqua was detained by Smith and two others, tied up and interrogated as to the whereabouts of the axe and knife. For hours, the suspected Umpqua denied any and all knowledge of the missing items. Interestingly though, even during this time, trading continued amongst a number of smaller parties in which the hungry trappers bartered for shellfish and berries the Umpqua had brought to trade. Finally though, the axe was found amongst the detained Umpqua's effects, though the knife never was, and he was free. Though he was indeed guilty of the theft, this particular Umpqua was a chief amongst his people, and now felt much aggrieved at his treatment by these American interlopers. He retreated across the river and complained to his fellow chiefs, demanding some kind of retributory action be taken in defense of his honor. The most senior chief in the group dissuaded him from this pursuit though, arguing that he had not been so egregiously assaulted as to merit the killing of the trappers. However, it would be only a short time later when that same chief, having re-engaged in trading with the trapping party, was himself offended. The two conflicting accounts of what happened next are as follows. In the Umpqua's recounting, the chief in question thought it would be greatly amusing to ride about the camp on one of the fine mounts in possession of the trappers. The trapper who owned the horse ordered him off at gunpoint, and a fight then and there was narrowly avoided. In the trapper's account, the chief was in no uncertain terms directed to dismount, but no kind of firearm was brandished. Despite the disparity in accounts, In either case, an immediate confrontation was avoided. The Umpqua met again across the river and decided that immediate retribution was still not the most prudent answer, and so the auspices of normality with the trappers should be maintained. Hence, the Umpqua who had agreed to guide Smith and his cohorts upriver agreed to stay at the campsite with them in order to leave the next morning. Before his companions left, though, plans were made for exacting the revenge the Umpquas felt to be rightfully theirs. Ostensible agreements were made to resume trading the next day, and the trappers fell into preparing their meals and readying themselves for a night's sleep. Jedediah Smith had his suspicions as to the Umpqua's intent, but could do little more than feign normality and carry on with the evening's tasks. With his small force against the several dozen Umpqua, here in the middle of nowhere, any attempt at an offensive attack would likely result in their small party being overrun. Though there is no record of it, Smith may have conferred with his more senior party members as to the most plausible courses of action. But no determined defensive plan was set in place, nor were the men notified of any suspected heightened threat. However, the next morning, as Smith and company warily paddled their canoe around a bend in the river and out of sight, many in the camp were still asleep. In the succeeding hour or so, many would wake up and begin their morning tasks of checking their equipment and procuring themselves some breakfast before setting about the more laborious tasks of their day. Smith, Leland, and Turner, along with their guide, carried out their intended mission of scouting out a more desirable route to travel. As they made their way back, they paddled with the vigor of men looking forward to a hearty breakfast after a hard morning's work. Then, just as they approached the bend in the river around which they had disappeared earlier that morning, they heard a riotous commotion coming from the camp, still hidden from view. As Smith, Leland, and Turner conferred with each other as to what the cause might be, the Umpqua guide snatched Smith's rifle and in one deft, intentional motion, tipped the canoe over, spilling them all into the river. The Umpqua swam to the western bank, while Smith, Leland, and Turner made it to the eastern bank, just in time to take cover from a volley of fire coming from a hidden group of Umpquas their former canoe mate had swum to for cover. They made their way to the top of a low promontory overlooking their campsite from across the river, and were greeted with a scene that must have haunted their nightmares for the remainder of their lives. All of the men in camp were now dead. Only minutes before their arrival, as their friends and comrades were still waking, a force of 200 Umpqua had overrun the camp. Some of the men had been cooking breakfast, some cleaning their weapons, and some were still asleep in their blankets when they were fell upon and cut down in a matter of minutes by Umpqua war clubs, hatchets, and arrows. Smith and company could only watch on as the aftermath unfolded, in which all of their belongings, including furs they had worked 2 years in acquiring, were either stolen or destroyed. Their livestock milled about nervously, made skittish by the sudden commotion and iron scent of blood. Eventually, they too were taken by the Umpqua. One man, Moses Black, had managed to dive into the river and escape his pursuers. According to his later account, he had been cleaning his rifle when 2 Umpqua appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and demanded he relinquish his weapon to them. Black had refused, and after a short tussle, he had turned and ran after being slashed across the back by the Umpqua's knives. He had managed to jump into the river and avoid the arrows and rocks that rained down around him, making it to the eastern bank of the river and escaping. On his flight to the river, he had seen Thomas Virgin being hacked to pieces by a pair of Umpqua warriors, and another trapper, whom he believed to be Thomas Dawes, being chased down by a group of Umpqua in a canoe. Smith, Leland, and Turner, however, had no knowledge of Black's escape, and thus both parties, Smith and company as well as Moses Black, believed themselves to be the sole survivors of the massacre. However, regardless of their communication breakdown, the only viable destination for any trapper lost in that hostile country was to make their way north, as the party had originally intended, to Fort Vancouver. A tortuous hike of roughly 200 miles up rocky shoreline and through unforgiving woodlands that would be incredibly taxing for even fit, well-fed individuals. It would not be until August 8th that Moses Black would struggle to the gates of Fort Vancouver. He was half dead and being nearly carried by a kindly Tillamook native who had taken it upon himself to guide the starving, desperate man to his destination. At first, Black could not bring himself to speak, so shaken were his nerves. The commander of the fort ordered the gates opened and for the clearly traumatized man to be brought in and cared for. After being wrapped in blankets and given a warm drink, Black was able to still his nerves long enough to articulate the horrors of his plight. A retributive excursion was immediately planned by the fort's commander, Captain John McLaughlin. Runners were sent out to the surrounding tribes, notifying them that a handsome reward would be paid to any natives who brought in survivors of the recently perpetrated massacre. The next day at around noon, Smith, Leland, and Turner staggered to the gates of the fort, themselves in little better condition than Moses Black. They too had procured Tillamook guides after making their way roughly 120 miles up the coast. Though both Black and Smith's party were all thrilled to learn that they were not, in fact, the sole survivors of the massacre, their cross-referencing of accounts also confirmed the sad truth that there were no other survivors. This, as in so much of the history of the Old West, is also a matter of some dispute in differing accounts. Umpqua accounts speak of two native women who were traveling with the party and were left unharmed, even eventually marrying into the tribe. Though they were not mentioned in any of Smith's journal entries, nor in the accounts of his contemporaries, that does not mean the Umpqua accounts were untrue. It would not have been uncommon for parties of trappers to provide either employment or safe travel to local tribespeople as their comparatively sizable and well-armed contingent made their way through the territory. However, we do know that every single trapper present, other than Smith, Leland, Turner, and Black, was killed there at the campsite on the Umpqua River. Their names were Thomas Dawes, John Gaither, Abraham LaPlante, Emmanuel Lazarus, Touchant Marichal, Martin McCoy, Joseph Palmer, Peter Ranney, Harrison Rogers, Charles Swift, Thomas Virgin, a former slave known as Ranza, and perhaps most tragically, Marion, the Indian boy whom they had taken into their party, by some accounts forcefully, in order to provide him with either protection, use him for labor, or both. All died tragically violent, terrifying deaths under a dark forest canopy, thousands of miles from most of their homes. Smith left only two written accounts of the attack, one to his brother and another to William Clark. Both are relatively terse in nature, and though sorrow is undoubtedly expressed on Smith's behalf, the veneer of his imperturbability remained uncracked. Undoubtedly, though, Smith and the other survivors were all psychologically traumatized and burning for revenge. Smith was informed by a sympathetic Captain McLaughlin that all would be done within his power to restore what property he could of Smith's, but that marshaling an all-out assault on the Umpquas was highly imprudent and thus out of the question. Crestfallen and physically depleted, Smith, Black, Leland, and Turner would eventually recover enough to make their way southeast to the yearly Mountain Man Rendezvous in present-day Wyoming. Smith would eventually make his way back to St. Louis, and after a short-lived retirement from the mountain man life, find himself on the Cimarron River in present-day Kansas. It would be here, in 1831, that Jedediah Smith, legendary mountain man, would meet his end at the hands of the dreaded Comanche. But that, like the plethora of other harrowing stories from Jed Smith's short but remarkable 32-year life, is another story for another time. In 1827, a bedraggled group of mountain men made their way in a long train of humans and pack animals through the Mojave Desert in what is today southeastern California. As temperatures soared and water supplies dwindled, the leader of the party, Jedediah Strong Smith, hoped to make contact with the tribe who had saved him when he passed through this same territory a year ago. The tribe, who gave the desert its name, were known as the Mojave. A year before,
Reaching the Mojave had been Smith's saving grace. Like all mountain men expeditions, he and his company had been in search of territory that was both abundant in beaver and unclaimed by any notable military power, be that native tribes or European or Mexican officials. The world of the mountain men was steeped in cultural, national, and ethnic ambiguity. Their goal was not to destroy or subvert any of the peoples they came across, but to accumulate as many furs as possible, namely beaver pelts, and to head back east to make use of their fortunes by buying land or otherwise improving their station in American society. Jedediah Smith had come west from New York as a young man, finding his way onto an expedition out of St. Louis. He learned quickly that in order to survive in the austere and often inhospitable American West, one had to adapt quickly, think clearly, and move decisively. Or they would soon die a hard death many miles from home. This was the world of gray, where the enemy of one's enemy was a friend until they too became an enemy. Such was the case for Jedediah Smith's beleaguered party. In the intervening year, trappers from another band based out of Taos, New Mexico, had abused and killed a number of Mojave before swiftly departing from their lands, headed west to California. The Mojave saw no difference, nor would they have any real way of telling, in the Taos party that had abused them and Smith's party, which finally found their village and dragged themselves in, begging for food, water, and fresh horses. At first, the Mojave were friendly enough, sharing and trading food and water, though refusing to part with any horses. Actually, considering the circumstances, they were pretty darn nice. Smith even ran into a Mojave man named Francisco who had worked for his expedition the year before. Francisco was friendly, but informed Smith of the Taos trappers killing his tribesmen during the last year and hanging their bodies from trees. Smith knew this was certainly not good, and beseeched Francisco to take gifts to his chief and inform him that Smith and his party had no intention of committing any such acts, and only hoped to resupply and move on westward. The Mojave, for their part, seemed willing enough to help. They helped the trappers resupply and gave them fresh mounts, even provided grass canoes so the trappers could more easily cross the Colorado River with their belongings. The mountain men were exceedingly grateful for the help and seemingly unaware of any danger. But when they were halfway across the river, the Mojave sprang their attack, attacking with a barrage of arrows, rocks, and spears. In what took only a matter of seconds, 10 men were hacked, pierced, and bludgeoned to death as their dying screams mixed with the war cries of the Mojave, the cracking of bones, and the placid rippling of the Colorado River. The attack took place with such ferocity and surprise, the 9 remaining members could only make their way as fast as possible to the other side, amidst a barrage of arrows and rocks and spears, to try and take cover. And as the Mojave hacked the 10 unfortunate trappers into pieces, and also carried off 2 native women traveling with the party, there was a momentary lull in their attack. As Smith took stock of their available weaponry, some knives, some hatchets, and 5 rifles with limited ammunition. And what must have been an agonizing few minutes of nerve-rattling silence, the men lashed knives to the longest, straightest branches they could find, double-checked the shot in their rifles, and unsheathed their hatchets in anticipation of the close, bloody conflict to come. Smith wrote in his diary that he had reassured his men that they would in fact survive the attack that was soon to come. But, he confided, he did not actually believe this was possible. However, he remained cool, and after allowing the oncoming Mojave to charge within rifle range, ordered a volley to be shot into their midst. 2 Mojaves were killed outright. It was never the custom of any native tribe to sacrifice large numbers of warriors to gain a victory or a position, and accordingly, the Mojave broke their attack and retreated to the safety of the village. This afforded the trappers a chance to slip out into the desert and head west from near today's Needles, California, to today's San Fernando Valley. Here, they were found and cared for by a local California rancher. Then, they set about their way north through the San Joaquin Valley in hopes of meeting with a group that they had left there the year before. From here, near the present-day city of Modesto, they were to continue northward on a journey that would see them survive inclement weather, hostile European powers, and, on another perhaps even more terrifying occasion, an attack at the hands of the Umpqua tribe. Smith would go on to survive that trip, make it all the way back to the yearly rendezvous in Wyoming, and even tried to retire in St. Louis. But soon, the trail would call him again, and at the age of 33, Jedediah Smith would be murdered on the Cimarron River by a band of the notoriously ruthless Comanche. His story is perhaps the greatest unknown odyssey in American history. But that is a story that will have to wait for another time.
Klamath Lake, Oregon, May 9th, 1846. In the middle of the night, a group of mountain men lie in much-deserved sleep after a hard day's travel of roughly 60 miles through the rugged terrain of southern Oregon. Their party, 14 strong, is composed of experienced mountain men from a variety of background. Included among them are 3 native Delaware tribesmen, as well as the French-descendant, St. Louis-born Basil Lajeunesse. They are led by John C. Fremont, a former U.S. Army cartographer who has, by means of both merit and a powerful father-in-law, managed to secure himself a congressional appointment to explore the American West. For the better part of the 1840s, he has conducted exploratory missions throughout the West. However, much of the territory he is exploring does not belong to the United States. It, in fact, belongs to Mexico. Though fur trappers, traders, sailors, and whalers have been finding their way to California by sea or by overland crossing for decades now, the territory of Northern California is still, at this point in 1846, relatively unknown and uninhabited. It is owned, ostensibly, by Mexico, as it had been owned by the Spanish before. But in reality, neither government has invested much in the way of resources towards settling the wild lands that lay to the north and to the east of the mission systems that hug the coastline. By and large, this area of Northern California and Oregon is, in fact, under the control of the tribes who have long ruled their respective areas of domain from the San Joaquin Valley to the Cascade Mountains. This meant that the ruling government's headquarters, thousands of miles away in Mexico City, was of little to no use to the Mexican citizens inhabiting the area. However, the land was bountiful, and, at a time when the population was scarcely more than a few thousand people in Northern California, plentiful and ready for the taking by any settler with means and intentions to do so. As was the case in Texas a decade earlier, this openness and availability has drawn a fair amount of American farmers, ranchers, and entrepreneurs. The lack of regulation from the Mexican government provides an enticing prospect for those who have, as of yet, been unable to secure a plot of land and sustain a livelihood elsewhere. The vast, open swaths of ungoverned and unsettled territory also draws the interest of the United States government. Since the expedition of Lewis and Clark 4 decades earlier, the national adherence to the doctrine of manifest destiny has become increasingly vociferous. As the desire for a continent-spanning nation has become more and more apparent amongst the voting public, and the outcry for greater settlement begins to trickle in from Americans living in Northern California, President John Tyler, and then his successor James K. Polk, begin to take increasing interest in wresting the territory from Mexico. But first, the United States must have a better understanding of the territory they hope to overtake and annex. Thus, the services of John C. Fremont have been enlisted on a number of exploratory jaunts that have seen the inveterate, well-connected explorer cover vast swaths of the Rockies and Sierra Nevadas, not to mention numerous trips through deserts and to the Pacific coastline. Fremont now finds himself here, on the shoreline of the vast Klamath Lake, on yet another excursion being undertaken under the decidedly odd pretense of exploring a country that is not his to explore. Now, it seems another layer is being added to this mission by James K. Polk himself. In the week prior, Fremont's company had been surprised on the trail by a hurried, breathless U.S. Marine lieutenant named Archibald Gillespie. Lieutenant Gillespie had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, materializing from amidst the hulking redwoods like a travel-weary specter. Though his presence seems a curious novelty to most of these men, he brings news of great import for Fremont. Gillespie has been dispatched by President James K. Polk himself, with messages for the American consuls in Los Angeles as well as for John Fremont. After making his way from Washington, D.C. to Mexico and then taking a ship to Los Angeles, Gillespie was informed that Fremont's expedition was on its way north, hundreds of miles ahead of him. Gillespie had made an incredible effort through environments that his training as a Marine in the 1830s had not prepared him for in order to catch up to Fremont and Company and deliver the secret messages. What the messages say will be lost to history, but it is thought to concern Fremont's involvement in the coming efforts to annex California for the United States. The men in Fremont's company are unsure of the exact nature of the correspondence, but are sure that they now find their leader in a fitfully distracted state. He had conferred with Gillespie late into the night as he pored over the letters. He had been so assured of their safety and so ensconced in his new business at hand with Gillespie that Fremont had given all the men license to sleep freely, without posting a guard. While many in the party had seen this as a welcome relief, one man does not. His name is Christopher Houston Carson, otherwise known as Kit Carson. At 37 years old, he is not only a legendary mountain man, but has become an inadvertent pop culture figure. All across the eastern seaboard and the big cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., men, women, and children alike delighted in reading the dime novels replete with highly fictionalized accounts of his daring and expertise. Though Carson is the first to dispel any notion of his own celebrity, his renown is certainly not without cause. He has seen more of the continent than almost any man living at this time. He has traded, fought, and even married into local tribes on the Great Plains and in the vast Southwest. He has survived all manner of privation, hardship, and danger for over 2 decades in locales from the Rocky Mountains to the city of Los Angeles to the sun-drenched prairies of Kansas. He has spent over a decade as a mountain man in the company of legendary trappers such as Bill Williams, Jim Bridger, and Ewing Young. He had married an Arapaho woman named Singing Grass, and the couple had had 2 children. However, in 1839, Singing Grass had died of complications during labor, leaving Carson to care for 2 young daughters. He had remarried to a Cheyenne woman named Making Out Road, but the marriage had ended quickly in divorce, and his children had not been welcome. In April of 1842, after his youngest daughter, whose name is unknown, was killed in a tragic accident after falling into a vat of boiling soap, Carson had decided to bring his surviving daughter to Missouri to stay with relatives. While on a steamboat on the Missouri River, he was recognized by John C. Fremont, who engaged the vaunted frontiersman in conversation and convinced him to sign on as a guide for his new scientific expedition. Carson soon found himself again headed west, providing navigation and direction for Fremont's party. Over the course of the next few years, the 2 men and their small company would traverse vast expanses of the American West. By 1846, they have already made 2 expeditions and accumulated thousands of miles. By all accounts, Carson has been, time and again, the party's saving grace from certain disaster. However, Carson, despite his notoriety and confidence in his own skills, is a man keenly aware of his own limitations. He is a man from a poor family, and for all intents and purposes, illiterate. His natural inclination, despite his authority and experience and aptitude, is to defer the burden of leadership to the wealthy, well-connected, and well-educated Fremont. So, earlier in this evening, as the men had eaten dinner and prepared their beds, Carson had dutifully obliged to Fremont's decision not to post a guard for the evening. But as much as Carson's mind had prevented him from verbalizing his concerns to his boss, his nerves, acclimated to constant sensitivity from a life spent on the trail, will not let him sleep soundly. Carson feels assured that the party is indeed vulnerable to attack. In the weeks prior to their arrival at Klamath Lake, Fremont, Carson, and company had been involved in a number of skirmishes with natives throughout the Northern California area. The most notable of these being the Umpqua Massacre, also known as the Sacramento River Massacre. In late March of 1846, the Fremont party had arrived at the Lassen Ranch in the northern Sacramento Valley, only to be informed by settlers that they believed a native attack upon them was imminent. Taking them at their word, and eager to seize an opportunity to both pad his military record as well as to instill some measure of intimidation into the surrounding natives, Fremont headed out in search of the native forces said to be amassing nearby. Under his charge were 60 Americans, including the trappers in his party, as well as, quote, 9 Delaware Indians, 2 California Indians, and 5 members of a nearby trading post. On April 5th, they had come upon a large camp of the Wintu people. Though this was indeed a large settlement, there was no indication that the people within were in the process of marshaling any sort of assault upon the settlers in the area. However, Fremont saw their sheer number and presence in the area as sufficient cause to order an attack. The village was set upon from 3 sides by the forces under Fremont's command. Thomas Breckinridge, a member of Fremont's exploratory party and present at the incident, gave the following account. The order was given to ask no quarter and to give none. The settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. Estimates of the number of Wintu people killed in the attack ranged from 150 to 700, with many drowning or being shot as they fled into the river. Word had spread quickly among all tribes of Northern California and Oregon of the great massacre inflicted upon the native people, perpetrated by the dark-haired, long-bearded officer and his party of mountain men. Though seemingly untroubled by the butchery, as he had so often been privy to in his life on the frontier, Carson is all too keenly aware of the potential consequences such actions might incur. Sometime after midnight, his wire-tight nerves snapped Carson out of his shallow slumber. Amidst the lapping of waves on the lake shore, the crackling of coals in the campfire, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, an odd, dull thumping noise causes his eyes to snap open, and immediately surveil the campsite. With only the light of the campfire to illuminate the scene, Carson can at first find nothing amiss. Then his eyes settle on the oddly contorted position in which his good friend Basil La Jeunesse is sleeping. "What's the matter over there, Basil?" Carson inquires. Then he notices an odd glistening of the firelight off La Jeunesse's head and torso. Within seconds, the situation is clear to the experienced mountain man. His friend has been killed, bludgeoned by a native warrior's club, and the camp is under attack. Carson, the first in the camp to awake to this horror, calls out, "Indians!" and fires his pistol into the darkness. As Carson's cry is still echoing off the trees surrounding them, the other men are awakened. Lucian Maxwell, Alex Godey, and Dick Owens, all longtime friends and compatriots of Carson's, now have their pistols and tomahawks drawn, eyes searching the night, seeking any kind of available cover. Arrows whistle by them, thudding into the tree trunks as dark figures whirl about just outside the light of the fire. A Delaware tracker known as Crane grabs a rifle and attempts to fire into the darkness, but it is either unloaded or misfires. As a few attacking warriors dash through the camp, Crane attempts to club them with his now otherwise useless firearm. In his fury, he becomes unaware of his position in front of the fire, making him a well-illuminated target for his attackers. Moments after being exposed by the light of the fire, Crane's torso is filled with arrows, and he falls dead. As Carson's eyes sweep the campsite, he hears a loud, guttural moan from his right. Looking over his shoulder, he sees the motionless body of Denny. his good friend and a much-beloved Delaware tracker. Turning his attention again towards the center of the camp, hoping to catch some of the attacking warriors in the same firelight that had doomed the Delaware crane, Carson sees a lone warrior. Resplendent in full war paint and headdress, standing his ground in the middle of the camp, fighting with unabashed fury. With a fine steel tomahawk, he cuts and slashes at the camp defenders, exhorting the other attackers with his war cries. Carson presumes this to be the chief, as do the other experienced mountain men in the party. The next volley of shots from their rifles and pistols renders the attacking chief no more, as he too falls next to the flickering campfire. For the bulk of the next hour, the attacking warriors make repeated, though seemingly haphazard, attacks upon the campsite, hoping to reclaim the body of their fallen leader. Eventually, the attacks abate, and the survivors spend the next few hours in a pensive state, waiting for another assault to materialize from the darkness. Finally, the sun begins to peek over the craggy mountains surrounding the lake. Some of the men set about laying blankets over the bodies of Denny, Crane, and La Jeunesse as Carson and Fremont examine the fallen chief. He is, Carson is sure, a Klamath, a people he has derided before as a mean, low-life, and treacherous race. The chief, now cold in death, his ornate war bonnet crumpled by his last fall, is covered in jagged designs of bright war paint. Carson would later recall him to be the bravest Indian I ever saw. But in this moment, as his comrades lie strewn in death on the ground around him, Carson is overcome with an unconquerable mix of grief and rage. As his eyes blur and his nostrils flare, he deliberately takes the tomahawk, secured to the chief's wrist with a leather thong, from its owner. For a few moments, Carson examines the weapon with the curiosity and awe of a seasoned cultural anthropologist. The weapon is heavy-headed, but well-balanced, the handle sitting nicely in the palm, and its blade razor-sharp. Then, in a sudden torrent of rage that shocks Fremont and the newcomer Gillespie, Carson raises the weapon up and powerfully, repeatedly, smashes it into the face and head of the fallen chief. Again and again, the blows rain down, until the chief's head is, by Carson's later estimation, all knocked to pieces. When his grief is momentarily satiated, Carson confers with Fremont as to the next course of action. Revenge, both agree, must be the order of the day. First, though, there is the business of burying their comrades. The 3 dead men are wrapped in blankets and strapped sideways onto their horses. Fremont and Carson initially planned to bury their friends at a scenic spot on the lake shore. However, as they travel in search of a suitable location, the bodies of the dead men are repeatedly bludgeoned and knocked off of their mounts by the numerous trees that obfuscate any clear path through the territory. Soon, the bodies are bruised, and the task becomes so distasteful that the company of men decide that their unfortunate cohorts must be buried on the spot, in the cold, rocky soil of the forest. As a few of the men stand guard, the remainder claw at the ground with their knives, eventually digging out a singular, shallow grave big enough for 3. The men are buried with little ceremony but the prayers of their comrades, and covered with logs and rocks in order to ward off predators. With their comrades now buried, the men's grief and rage runs unfettered. Their first order of business now is to find any Klamath that they can and exact retribution upon them. Their Delaware scouts, after completing their own burial rituals for their fallen comrades, are the first to head out into the silent labyrinth of trees in search of any lingering Klamath. They are gone only a short time when they reappear, this time each holding a freshly taken scalp. "Was sick, better now," one said. The Delaware, Carson, and a small group then head up the Klamath Lake shoreline, scouting for a larger village. About 10 miles ahead of Fremont and the remainder of the men, Carson and the company stumble upon a large village of Klamath. They, too, are quickly spotted by the Klamath, whose women and children scatter in all directions as the men in the village race to arm themselves, and those who had been out fishing hurriedly beach their canoes in a rush to reach their weapons and fellow defenders. With the element of surprise lost, Carson and his men must now make an immediate attack, which they do, with another massacre ensuing. Though accounts vary, with Carson insisting that no women or children were killed, at least one old woman was found among the dead. The huts of the villages are set ablaze, which Carson deems a beautiful sight to behold. As smoke and flames engulf the village, Fremont, disappointed to have missed out on the action, gallops into the camp with the rest of his men. Though he has been unable to catch up to Carson in time for the attack, it will be only a matter of hours until Fremont can claim a coup of his own. As Carson is surveying the destruction wrought by his small attacking band on this, the largest Klamath village in the area, a lone warrior returns and, seeing what has occurred in his absence, draws an arrow aimed directly at Carson. The sudden motion catches Carson's eye, and he draws his pistol and squeezes the trigger, but the weapon misfires. Fremont, a few yards away, spots the Klamath taking aim and spurs his powerful gray warhorse, Sacramento, at the man, trampling him under hoof. The lone Klamath is then pounced upon by a Delaware named Segunde and bludgeoned to death with a war club. Though Carson's allegiance to Fremont has thus far been unwavering, this incident will forever instill an unflagging obedience to the Army officer that will carry on for the rest of Carson's life. Now, as the Klamath village lies in destruction, with Klamath warriors strewn about the ground in their final repose, Carson again confers with Fremont as to their next move. He is informed that they must now, with the advent of the information brought in the top-secret letters by the Marine Archibald Gillespie, return to California. There is a rebellion on against the Mexican government, and Fremont, Carson, and company will all play a pivotal role. The party heads south, leaving the Klamath village to burn and the survivors to mourn. The village is never rebuilt, and the survivors scatter to other bands. Though they have been held accountable by Fremont and Carson for the deaths of their friends, many experts today believe that the Klamath had, in fact, been innocent of any involvement in the attack on the Americans' camp. Instead, it is now believed that the offending tribe had been the Modoc, a culturally related but longtime enemy of the Klamath people. It does not seem that Carson was terribly concerned with the deeds of himself and his men that day as, in his later account, he would deem it a perfect butchery. Carson, though, already a famous figure, will go on to cement his legend in the coming decades, as will Fremont. Few figures in American history have been as consequential as these two men, and their deeds will, for better or worse, carry great weight for years well after their deaths. The stories of exploration, navigation, adventure, survival, combat, and killing seem almost too numerous to tell, and though rest assured, History at the OK Corral will do our best to tell them all, for tonight, they are other stories for other times.
In 2015, The Revenant, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and directed by Alejandro G. Inarritu, was released to great critical acclaim and box office success. In 2016, the film would see great success at all major award shows, most notably netting 3 Academy Awards. But The Revenant lied, or at least wildly misled you. Hugh Glass was indeed a legendary mountain man, and he was indeed attacked by a grizzly and left for dead in 1823, and he did indeed complete a harrowing journey that deservedly has gone down in Western lore as one of the all-time tales of survival. But he had no native wife, nor any native nor adopted children, and he did not exact revenge on the companions who left him, nor did his legendary career end where the movie does. Hugh Glass would ultimately forgive his betrayers and return to the unknown wilds he loved so dearly, and ultimately he would die a hard death at the hands of his enemies, many miles from all he knew and loved. Glass's biography is replete with obfuscation and confusion, with some evidence pointing to his being born in Pennsylvania and some pointing to him being born in Ireland. Either way, he is said to have taken to the high seas and served as a sailor and possibly a pirate for a time, ultimately jumping ship in the Gulf of Mexico to escape being the prisoner of the notorious pirate John Lafitte. He swam to shore in Texas and made his way north, ultimately signing on with the trapping expedition and beginning his career as a mountain man. He survived numerous attacks from native tribes, served alongside other legendary mountain men such as Jedediah Smith and William Ashley, to name just a few, and even penned a moving letter to a fellow trapper's family after the man passed away in a fight depicted between the Arikara and the mountain men in the opening scenes of the movie. After being mauled by the grizzly, Glass would indeed be abandoned by William Fitzpatrick and a teenage Jim Bridger. Glass would indeed essentially crawl hundreds of miles, surviving off of roots and buffalo carcasses to get to the nearest fort. He would then indeed pursue Bridger, but only to scare him and basically call him a little jerk, and Bridger would go on to be one of the most legendary mountain men of all time. Fitzpatrick had joined the army, and while Glass did indeed track him down in order to retrieve his rifle and money, which he was given, Fitzpatrick's commanding officer empathetically but emphatically informed Glass that he would not be able to offer him any further retribution, as now Fitzpatrick was property of the U.S. Army. So there was no climactic encounter in which Glass and Fitzpatrick had a to-the-death knife fight until Glass could kill Fitzpatrick and thus secure his vengeance. It's an unfortunate liberty to take with this story, to be sure, as it completely changes its trajectory from what it really was. Ultimately, it was a story of forgiveness and a moving on with one's life, and it was turned into a simple story of satisfying a lust for revenge. But I digress. The movie shows Glass enduring another attack or two, mostly at the hands of the Arikara, but in reality, he had signed on with another fur company, survived being attacked by another group of natives, been shot in the back with 2 arrows, and made another harrowing journey to return to the nearest fort, from which he recovered and managed to carry on again. He headed to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where the Gila River was proving to be a hotspot for trappers at the time. Hugh Glass returned to trapping, guiding, and serving as a hunter for the U.S. military commanders in the area who needed meat for their men. Glass proved to be quite adept as a scout and hunter for the U.S. Army outfits who were, by and large, hapless in this new territory that they had little to no first-hand knowledge of. Hugh signed on for a job as a hunter for Fort Cass, a fort near the junction of the Yellowstone River and the Bighorn Rivers. He worked through the winter, but in the early spring of 1833 decided it might be a good time to try trapping the Yellowstone River. Hugh and 2 of his trapper cohorts from the fort, a man named Hilone Leonard and a man named Colin Rose, headed out to head down the river. However, the river was still largely frozen, and thus they had to make their way along the banks, looking for open spots to set their traps. They had not gone more than a few miles when they were ambushed from behind by a group of Arikaras. With no way to retreat away from the river, Glass, Leonard, and Rose quickly came to the sickening realization that the only possible direction in which to flee would be across the coverless expanse of the frozen river. They must have known their chances were next to non-existent, but all 3 chose to sell their lives as dearly as possible, doing their utmost to flee across the river. In what order they fell, we have no record. Whether they cried out in pain or died instantly, we will never know. But neither Hugh Glass nor his compatriots would make it across the frozen river on that chilly spring day. They would all be mutilated as a message to their friends that found them, and scalped. It was noted that the Crow tribe, amongst whom Glass had spent much time and become very well acquainted, accompanied Beckworth on a burial detail. His account, considered less than wholly reliable but not necessarily entirely apocryphal, is as follows. The crying was truly appalling. The 3 men were well known and highly esteemed by the Crows. When their bodies were lowered to their last resting place, numberless fingers were voluntarily chopped off and thrown into the graves. Hair and trinkets of every description were also contributed, and the graves were finally filled up. A few weeks later, a group of trappers came across the group of Arikara who had attacked Glass and his comrades. This group of Arikara claimed to the trappers to be Crow, who the trappers were friendly with, but the trappers noticed that these Crow were in the possession of some of Glass's effects, namely his rifle and his knife. When they found out that this group were actually Arikara, masquerading as Crows, in order to evade the trouble from this much larger force of Glass's countrymen, they became enraged. Johnson Gardner, the leader of the party of trappers, had the Arikara present tied up, scalped alive, and then thrown into a fire to wriggle like worms until they expired in the flames. Weeks later, it must be noted, Gardner would suffer the same fate at the hands of avenging Arikaras. And so the West went, one giant cycle of lives lost and legends built, only to be forgotten again, like so many winters past, in this unforgiving land. Hugh Glass's life was indeed awe-inspiring, and his legacy inarguable. What history remembers him for is a singular instance of his unimaginably staunch resolve to survive overwhelming circumstances that would have surely, and often did, doom lesser men. Glass would die as he lived, a man of action. And while the stories of his exploits remain innumerable, those are stories for another time.
May 27th, 1831. Present-day southern Kansas. A group of New Mexico-based merchants are gathered in a tight cluster, making their way southwest down the Cimarron River. They are nervous, with an unspoken tension pervading the air that surrounds their small party. They have stopped to take a respite from the late spring heat, having just completed the trading they had come so far to engage in. But here, in the open expanses of the prairie, business was not always just business. Things here on the southern plains could, and often did, devolve quickly into overt, horrific violence. It was not wholly uncommon for an enterprising, overly optimistic merchant to venture out into these lands with hopes of brokering highly profitable trades and solidifying lucrative relationships with the rulers of this harsh, unremitting territory, the Comanche. Many of these hopeful capitalists were simply never seen again. Some returned wealthy men, some returned traumatized survivors of Comanche wrath. These merchants, though, had managed to broker mutually beneficial relationships with the Comanche that had lasted for decades by this point in the early 19th century. They had occupied the territories of what is now the state of New Mexico and was then known as New Spain for generations, nearly as long as the Comanche. In the preceding century and a half, the Comanche had unleashed a torrent of violence across what are now the states of Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. Their motivations were in part retribution, payback for their cruel treatment at the hands of neighboring tribes like the Cheyenne and Blackfoot, and in part ambition. They, like the Spanish to the south, were intent on capturing as much of the wide-open expanses of the American frontier as possible. But for all their reputation as war fighters and empire builders, they were also incredibly adept traders. Of course, the threat of mortal violence is a powerful bargaining chip, but the Comanche prided themselves on being knowledgeable and formidable negotiators and bartering for the goods they desired. These New Mexico merchants had largely avoided the violence of Comanche expansion by providing them with a reliable, sustainable source of trade for the goods they valued but could not produce themselves. The Comanche possessed the largest collective swath of North American territory of any tribe on the continent. They were rich in land, buffalo meat, buffalo hides, and horses. But they had no tradition in pottery nor weaving, nor any access to metals such as copper and iron that they highly prized. The iron was highly prized for use as arrow and spearheads, while the copper was often beaten into discs and worn as jewelry on necklaces, bracelets, or woven into the long braids of thick hair the Comanche prided themselves on. Many of the paints that they could procure from traders were of more vibrant hues and resilient finishes than the ones they made themselves from natural dyes and animal fats. Cotton shirts, hats, jewelry, and of course, firearms were all prized to differing degrees by the Comanche, and, more often than not, the Comanche bartered with men like this small group of weary, weather-beaten traders who were often comprised of small bands of family members or close friends. They were the descendants of Spanish settlers who had often intermarried into the surrounding tribes. Their way of life in the desolate expanses of New Mexico and West Texas was a perpetually difficult, dangerous affair. But after peace with the Comanche had been brokered by Governor Juan Bautista de Anza in 1778, trade between the Spanish descendant settlers of New Spain and the Comanche began in earnest. Before long,
A regular system of trade was established where intrepid bands of traders ventured out into the no-man's land that was Comancheria. Most were men from hard backgrounds who found little comparable opportunity anywhere else. Many died hard, horrendous deaths at the hands of the Comanche or other tribes like the Apache or the Kiowa. Many were robbed, many were killed, and many robbed and killed others. They developed their own fringe society away from the norms of New Spain or the burgeoning power of the United States. They became known as Comancheros for their proclivity and aptitude for dealing with a tribe whose mere mention could send waves of panic through settlements all through Texas and Mexico. This particular group of Comancheros here on the Cimarron River had traveled a long way to conduct their business, and now only hoped to get home with their profits as soon as possible. They spoke briefly in their huddled formation about the trades that they had made, the profits they had taken, and their unanimous desire to put distance between themselves and the party of Comanche they had just traded with. To a man, the small party was aware that there was nothing to stop the Comanche from trailing them for a while, only to kill them all, recoup the items they had traded away, and walk away with little to no consequence. But just as they were about to resume their course southward, one of them spots a figure only a few hundred yards in the distance. Even at this distance, it is clear the figure approaching them on horseback is not a Comanche. As the rider comes toward them, he attempts to wave them down to engage in conversation. As he draws nearer, it becomes apparent that he is an American. In fact, though the Comancheros would have no way of knowing it, this was one of the most well-known and well-traveled Americans alive at the time. While the Comancheros knew the vast expanses of their homeland like the backs of their hands, they did not know, nor in many instances could they scarcely imagine, the scope or extremity of this American man's travels in the previous decade. Barring but a few possible exceptions, this lone rider had seen more of the North American continent than anyone alive at the time. He had come from upstate New York, worked on freighter ships that sailed the expanses of the Great Lakes, and made his way to the burgeoning city of St. Louis. From there, he had traveled from the Dakotas to the Rocky Mountains, the Mojave Desert, the missions of Southern California, the San Joaquin Valley, the Sierra Nevadas, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and then all the way north through present-day Oregon and Washington into Canada. He had survived the deadliest attacks on record, from the Arikara in South Dakota to the Mojave in California to the Umpqua in Oregon. He had worked with and under some of the most legendary names in mountain man history, men like William Ashley, Hugh Glass, Jim Bridger, William Wolfskill, Milton Sublette, William Sublette, Joseph Meek, and Bill Williams, to name but a few. Most of the men he had traveled and worked with, though, had died violent deaths in their pursuit of fortune in the wilds of a continent that they, in the initial throes of manifest destiny, believed to be rightfully and inherently theirs. He had narrowly survived a vicious mauling by an enraged grizzly bear, one that necessitated his ear being sewn back onto his head via crude frontier surgery without the benefit of anesthetic. This incident left him permanently scarred and saw him wear his hair longer from then on in order to hide the scars. He had been detained by Mexican officials in California who were in fact rightfully dubious as to the intentions of these curiously dressed Americans who claimed they were merely passing through their bountiful territory. Through it all, he had remained steadfast in his faith as a Methodist and his ardent commitment to the venture capitalism he hoped would provide for his family. His name was Jedediah Strong Smith. Just the year before, he had made his way back to St. Louis, cashed in on the pelts he had collected at the price of so many lives lost and miles covered, and vowed never to enter the mountains again. He purchased a sizable home on what is now Broadway Street in St. Louis and sent a banknote for $1,500 back to Ohio in order to purchase land neighboring one of his brother's farms. 3 of his younger brothers had come to live with him in St. Louis, where he hoped to be able to provide them with better economic opportunity than he had found upon his initial forays from home at their age. He repeatedly swore in numerous correspondence to family and friends that his days in the mountains were done. His mother had recently passed away, and the incessant internal tumult that had hounded him since he left home, another sentiment that often litters the journal entries and letters of Jedediah Smith, incessantly harped at his conscience that he should travel to his family's new homestead in Ohio to care for his aging father. But in the time since returning to St. Louis in 1829 and the spring of 1831, the incessant wanderlust that had driven him to such distances began to drown out the guilt that he felt for his extended departure from his home and family. He had written to the Secretary of War, John Eaton, requesting to be made part of a proposed military expedition into the Rocky Mountains. To be sure, there would be few men in the world more qualified to lead the expedition than Jedediah Smith, but Smith never received a response from Eaton, and the expedition never materialized. Smith then began to look towards the prospect of publishing his memoirs, along with the numerous maps he had compiled during his travels. Even throughout the most dire of times in his travels, Smith had, with at least some measure of consistency, recorded his thoughts in a series of journals. In addition, he was a skilled cartographer whose maps were accurate and reliable. He hoped to illuminate the entirety of the eastern seaboard and perhaps even Europe with tales of his exploits complete with the maps that he had drawn. To do this, though, he felt he needed to add at least one trip to his already expansive list of expeditions. The town of Santa Fe, in what is now the state of New Mexico, had been growing in population and reputation as a trading post and way stop on the trip to California. And so, after not hearing back from Secretary of War Eaton, Smith decided to sign on with an expedition to Santa Fe with William Sublett and David Jackson. The three men would lead a wagon train carrying roughly $20,000 in goods to Santa Fe. Smith also enlisted Samuel Parkman to assist in arranging his writings and maps into a publishable manuscript, as well as to polish his Spanish skills so that he might decipher some of the Spanish terms recorded in Smith's diaries with more accuracy. The trail from St. Louis to Santa Fe was well traveled, and even in 1831 was considered well established and comparatively safe. Few lives were lost annually to either privation or attacks from natives. In comparison to the trips Smith had been making for the past decade, this endeavor would have seemed to be a relatively easy affair, despite the distance being over 1,000 miles. The wagon train, complete with 83 men, left for Santa Fe in the spring of 1831, in high spirits with aspirations of completing a timely, profitable trip. They headed southwest, and initially, all had gone well. Then, trouble began to befall the party. First, on May 19th, a company clerk who had long worked for Sublett and Jackson, a man recorded only as Mentor, was murdered by Pawnee warriors when he wandered off from the main party near the Pawnee River, a tributary of the Arkansas River. Then, the water began to run out. By May 27th, the party was completely out of water for both men and livestock. All the established water sources on the trail had thus far proven dried up. On that morning, much the same as they had for the previous few mornings, Smith and his cohorts would pair up and fan out in different directions from their camp in an attempt to find any viable water sources. Smith and his partner, a man named Fitzpatrick, headed south on that morning, hoping to find a spring on the north side of the Cimarron River. The Cimarron itself flows through several mineral deposits, rendering the water not potable as it is too salty. However, several springs lie nearby the river which do produce drinkable water. Smith and Fitzpatrick thought perhaps they were getting close that morning when they had happened upon a depression in the flat landscape that harbored damp ground at its lowest point. Smith directed Fitzpatrick to stay there and attempt to dig for water in the depression, while he rode ahead to see if there were any springs nearby. While Fitzpatrick began digging, Smith headed off further south. Within a few miles, he was out of sight of Fitzpatrick. Within a few more, he came into sight of this band of Comancheros. The Comancheros are alarmed. The legendary mountain man lopes his horse towards them, speaking to them in broken Spanish, asking where water might be found. To the Comancheros, he presents a clear and present danger not only to himself, but to them as well. The Comancheros offer him no water, and only point him towards a spring a few miles away. The Comancheros offer him no water, and only point him towards a spring a few miles away. They also inform him in concise, broken English that the Comanche were nearby and that he would not be able to avoid them no matter his next move. Furthermore, he is informed that he must make the next move immediately, as he presented a liability to the Comancheros' party. Should the Comanche find him in their company, they might suppose him to be a spy and kill them all. This was not a risk the Comancheros were willing to take for the lonesome and now doubtless fear-stricken American. He was on his own. Seeing no better course of action, Jedediah Smith continues on in the direction of the spring the Comancheros had informed him of. He departs from the Comancheros, resolutely making his way forward and mustering all the courage and wherewithal he might bring to bear. He and his party would surely die without the water, and while he knew there was a very real possibility that the Comanche would usher him into an even more immediate end, Smith saw little other course of action. As the Comancheros watched from a distance, he makes his way further south, to what is now known as Wagon Bed Spring in southwestern Kansas. Just before he reaches the spring, a band of 15 to 20 Comanches come upon him. They have spotted Smith before he even departed the Comanchero party, and spent the time it took him to ride to the spring discussing in Spanish what they would do with this trespassing American. For all intents and purposes, Smith and his company were indeed trespassing. In fact, the entire trade they had been plying for the past decade or more was technically illegal and in violation of numerous treaties that forbade hunting and trapping in native or foreign lands. The Comanche, though, are not concerned with the legalities of any particular treaty on this day. They see him as an intolerable interloper, a representative of a people who have sought to invade their lands. Also, they may have seen him as sport. Smith does his best to stay calm, hailing the Comanche with a smile and signing to them in the ubiquitous sign language of the plains that he was merely passing through and hoping to slake his thirst as well as his horses. He searches the faces of the Comanche warriors who surround him, the notoriously stout and rugged-looking ponies striking such an odd juxtaposition against their master's formidable reputation. The Comanche, too, look different than any of the other tribes Smith has encountered on the plains. They themselves are shorter and stockier than their northern plains counterparts, with, especially at this time in the early 19th century, little of the cosmetic adornments of their plains cohorts, such as war bonnets or white-boned breastplates. The Comanche, in particular, cut a stark, terrifying figure even for the most experienced of travelers on the frontier. And, in accordance with their reputation, no warrior among them returns Smith's smile or salutations. For a few tense, terrifying seconds, the two parties stare silently at each other. Then, the Comanche begin to encircle Smith, moving into their positions while taunting Smith's horse, trying to spook him into throwing his rider. Smith, for his part, still attempts to broker some kind of peace that might allow him to trade some of his valuables for his safe passage back to his party. But as the situation rapidly develops, it becomes clear that the Comanche are not interested in any deal. Just as the Comanche have Smith half surrounded in a crescent moon formation, a shot rings out from a Comanche rifle. A lead ball tears into Jedediah Smith's right shoulder, as the noise simultaneously startles his horse, causing both animal and rider to wheel about 180 degrees. Smith had laid his Kentucky rifle across his lap before being accosted by the Comanche, and as his horse turned, Smith managed to shoulder the weapon and return fire, killing one of the warriors, whom later accounts would describe as a chief. As the Comanche warrior's body slumps from his mount and thuds to the hard Kansas dirt, Jedediah Smith reaches for one of the two single-shot pistols he keeps tucked in his belt. In the seconds it takes to accomplish this, the remaining Comanche warriors, now fully enraged at the killing of one of their own, pounce upon Smith, knocking him off of his horse. As soon as he hits the ground, it is all but certain Jedediah Smith knows he is going to die. The Comanche have spent so much effort attaining their empire in the southern plains, largely because of the immense buffalo herds that reliably roamed its expanses. In order to kill the gigantic, aggressive, and fleet-of-foot buffalo, the Comanche often employed the use of 12 to 14-foot spears that could be used to stab a buffalo from a distance. The animal would be struck under the ribs, so that the most damage might be done to the target's internal organs. The same tactic was employed against human enemy targets. From atop their stout ponies, the remaining Comanche drove their lances into the torso of America's most legendary, accomplished mountain men. The attack is incredibly swift and unspeakably violent, as the Comanche mock and club the dying man. The only mercy for the unfortunate Smith is that it is all over in a matter of seconds. As his body lies lifeless, covered in blood and plains dust, the Comanche strap their dead compatriot to his horse, take Smith's horse, his guns, and valuables, and leave him to the buzzards and the summer sun. Jedediah Smith's body would never be found, and it would be days later until the Comancheros would encounter the sublet Jackson party on the Santa Fe Trail. Here, they would produce Smith's pistols and rifle to his grief-stricken younger brother, Austin. The Comancheros had traded the Comanche for the items after their murder of Smith and acquired the Comanche's side of the story. They corroborated this with their own eyewitness accounts, and these accounts were relayed back to Smith's elderly widower father in Ohio in a letter from Austin Smith. The letter, heart-wrenching in its revelations even 2 centuries later, reads as follows. Your son Jedediah was killed on the Cimarron the 27th of May, on his way to Santa Fe by the Comanche Indians. His party was in distress for water, and he had gone alone in search of the above river, which he found when he was attacked by 15 or 20 of them. They succeeded in alarming his animal, not daring to fire on him so long as they kept face to face. So soon as his horse turned, they fired, and wounded him in the shoulder. He then fired his gun and killed their head chief. It is supposed they rushed upon him and dispatched him. An obituary would be published for him that fall in the Illinois Intelligencer, but no mention of his death was made in his adopted hometown of St. Louis's local publication. His memoirs and maps would not only not be published, but his legacy and legend would be largely forgotten by the public for the better part of a century and a half. Jedediah Smith never married, nor had any children. In his brief 32 years, he had managed to incessantly, seemingly impulsively, pursue his intentions of wealth and security to ends that had thus far been unheard of in American history. To add even more to the decidedly unserendipitous nature of Smith's final expedition, the remainder of the party on the Santa Fe Trail, including Sublette, Jackson, and Smith's younger brother Austin, were all able to find water and eventually make their way safely to Santa Fe. From here, Austin Smith would pursue his own successful career in mercantilism, and Sublette and Jackson would continue on to California in order to return with a large remuda of horses and mules to trade and sell in Santa Fe and Missouri. In the entirety of the year of 1831, the only lives lost on the Santa Fe Trail would be those of the unfortunate Minter at the hands of the Pawnee, and Smith at the hands of the Comanche. Life in the Old West was always hard, and often cheap. The violence and hardships that befell people of all races, religions, and backgrounds could be startlingly indiscriminate and stunningly swift. And so it was that one of the most expansive, interesting lives in American history was snuffed out. Despite all his exploits, he found himself but a stranger in a strange land, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But the annals of Old West history are replete with far more stories of Smith, his fellow mountain men, as well as the countless natives and settlers they interacted with. Tales of lives lost, fortunes gained, and miles traveled are more numerous than the stars in the open western sky. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a fellow history lover, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. And finally, be sure to follow us on TikTok, on Instagram, and subscribe to our newsletter, the links to all of which are down below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.